This episode is sponsored by Prep Dish. Prep Dish takes the stress out of putting homemade, healthy meals on the table. No more scrambling to figure out what's for dinner at the last minute. Make sure to head over to prepdish.com/fertilityfriday, all lowercase, to get your first 2 weeks of meal plans free of charge. This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 118. Welcome to the 118th episode of the Fertility Friday podcast. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Lisa from fertilityfriday.com, and this is your source for information about the fertility awareness method and all things fertility. As you know already, I started this podcast because I believe that every woman has the right to know exactly how her body and her fertility works. And for those of you who want to go deeper into the realm of fertility awareness charting and body literacy, I have a number of programs that allow you to do just that. And I'm really excited to announce a brand new way to work with me. So I'm actually now offering a one-time in-depth fertility assessment for those of you who are fairly confident with your charting, but looking for a deeper understanding of your cycles. So wanting to go that extra step to get that deeper interpretation of what your cycles are reflecting back to you about your overall health and fertility. And so by the end of our 60-minute session together, you'll not only gain clarity and insight about your cycles and how they relate to your health history, but you're also going to leave with a plan, concrete next steps to take to improve your cycles naturally. For more information about setting up your one-time fertility assessment with me, make sure to head over to fertilityfriday.com/workwithme to book your session today. Before we jump into today's episode, I want to take a moment and thank my sponsor, Prep Dish. So for any of you who've been listening to the podcast for a while, you'll know how much I focus on real food and the importance of getting your nutrition from food, especially when you're trying to restore your fertility. For example, if you've recently come off the pill or if you're just trying to improve your fertility in general. But I think one of the challenges is to come up with home-cooked meals on a day-to-day basis. I know it's challenging for me sometimes coming home, being tired, and having to come up with a meal for your family. And so Prep Dish takes all of that out of it. So instead of scrambling to figure out what you're going to cook when you're already tired and hungry, you get an email from Prep Dish every week with a shopping list. And so you go to the store, you pick up these specific things, and you come home, you do 2 to 3 hours of prep for the entire week so that when it comes to dinner time, you already have everything ready-made for you. So it's a huge game changer and time saver. And one of the things that I love about the recipes is that they are actually healthy. So it's real food. There are paleo options, gluten-free options. So make sure to head over to prepdish.com/fertilityfriday and you'll get your first 2 weeks of meal plans absolutely free. So now let's jump into today's show. And today I'm very excited to welcome my guest, Lori Eisenstadt, to the show. Lori is an international board-certified lactation consultant who has been working with breastfeeding moms and babies for over 25 years. Lori became a birth doula and a postpartum doula and soon became a lactation consultant. And over that time, she's worked with over 10,000 mothers and babies in private consultations to help them work through their breastfeeding challenges. Lori founded All About Breastfeeding, which is her private practice where she provides education, support, and advocacy for breastfeeding mothers. And Lori's also a podcaster. Her podcast, All About Breastfeeding, is an amazing resource for breastfeeding mothers. And it's something that I wish I had when I embarked on my own breastfeeding journey way back when. And I was recently featured on Lori's podcast, which is also titled All About Breastfeeding. And I love the tagline, the place where the girls hang out, haha. And on that episode, I shared my experience with breastfeeding. We really got into the realities of breastfeeding. So I'll link that episode to the show notes page if you want to check that out. And in today's show, we're going to be talking all about breastfeeding. Couldn't resist. And I'm really excited to have her on the show. So welcome to the show, Lori.
I'm thrilled to be here with you today, Lisa.
Well, thanks so much. And I'd love to start the show just by hearing a little bit more about your background and to get a sense of what inspired you to become a lactation consultant in the first place?
When I had my first baby, I had no idea the world that I was going to be literally falling into. And I had a birth experience that was okay. I gave birth vaginally in a hospital, but I felt like there were certain things that happened during the birth that I realized I was just basically taught how to be a good hospital patient. Now, not how to labor effectively. And throughout the whole birth, I felt like it was always like a game or a rush to the finish. And You've been in labor for 24 hours. If you can bring the baby down a little bit more, then we won't have to do a section. If you can bring the baby down a little bit more, then we'll just do forceps. If you can bring her down a little bit more in the next hour, then you could probably have a vaginal birth. So I always felt like it was under the gun. And I definitely had what I felt was a pretty good doctor. But the realization the first time around is that the doctor is typically not with you all the time. And you're relegated to the hospital staff that I had never met before. So I took a lot of care trying to find the right physician. And the reality was he was not there for me most of the time. So when I had her, I left the hospital, and over the next couple of weeks, I just knew I wanted to have another baby. But I also said, I just don't want to have her like that. I don't want to do that again. And it was before the days of the internet, and it was very hard to find the right people to connect with. And there wasn't a lot in the library. There was, thank you, Dr. Lamaze, and Dr. Bradley had just come into the scene. And my library didn't have much more information. But I found out that a library about a half hour away that I could join, they had many, many more books than my 2 books that my library had. So there became my education about birth. And I learned so much, and I realized the things that I wanted to change for my next pregnancy and labor. And I chose to have a home birth with a midwife. And the other thing that I did was I really educated myself, and I became a childbirth educator myself and started teaching classes. So I started teaching childbirth classes. I had my next 2 babies at home. And I also started learning a lot about midwifery. I started a grassroots midwifery group on Long Island, where I'm from. I learned a little bit more about breastfeeding, but I was still very entry level. So I had a home-based business on Long Island. I called it Pregnancy Connections, where I taught childbirth classes, and I had also become a birth doula. When I moved from New York to Arizona, I really wanted to find a midwifery apprenticeship, and it was just difficult to find one. So I wound up getting a job in a local hospital, and I met my very first IBCLC, which stands for International Board Certified Lactation Consultant. And I'm sure I was insulting to her because I couldn't figure out what she did all day. She said she was paid to help women breastfeed. And I thought, that's a cushy job. Like, you just sit next to a mom and you just help her latch her baby on. And of course, I realized afterwards that it was much more than that. She asked me to shadow her. And when I shadowed her and saw the work that was involved, and I saw that she could take a mom who was I related to a lot of the mothers she worked with my first baby. I had such a tough time with breastfeeding. I was that mom with cracked and bleeding nipples, calling up La Leche League, couldn't attend meetings. They were far and few between, crying for help, but so incredibly stubborn that I just would not give up. And I spent a lot of time crying and in pain and floundering around. And when I saw my future mentor working with mothers in the hospital and taking them from being very disorganized, sometimes even painful in the hospital, to fairly confident moms who said, I see I do have milk and I can breastfeed. And I just saw the changes in the mom, and I saw how she related to the partners, and I saw this beautiful 3 people together in sync leave the hospital. And I also saw a lot of harder cases, and I saw a lot of frustration working with mothers who were told to give their babies bottles of formula. So there was a lot going on, but what I really walked away from was, wow, she is really making a difference in mothers and babies' lives. And I decided, I want that. I want to do that. And that's a quick synopsis of why I became a lactation consultant. And then I trained with her for a couple of years, and I got certified and I became one. But it's the same reason why I became a childbirth educator, because I saw that I could make a difference in other people's lives. I got turned on to birth, and I wanted to help mothers and dads and babies. And that led into becoming a doula, and I saw I could make a difference there. And the lactation consultant was just the next step. And I just saw that I always felt like if I left my kids to go out and do work in the world, I really, if at all possible, wanted to do something meaningful. And at that time, I found the meaning. And that's why I became a consultant.
Oh, I can so resonate with that. What you said about, finding something meaningful to do. So thank you for sharing how you became a lactation consultant. So one of the things that I wanted to ask you to really get our feet wet and get into this topic of breastfeeding is just from your experiences over the years, what would you say are some of the biggest misconceptions about breastfeeding? I feel like for me, one of the things I used to think before I actually breastfed a child of my own was that it was kind of natural, and I didn't necessarily think it would be easy, but I absolutely did not think it would be hard. Like it didn't occur to me that it might be difficult or challenging. It never crossed my mind. And I actually used to think that, say, if a woman stopped breastfeeding within the first couple of weeks, that she wasn't trying hard enough. Like I was super judgy about that kind of stuff. So I'm curious to know what some of the biggest misconceptions that you have seen kind of repeatedly in your work about breastfeeding.
I often say that I wish I had $1 for every mother I meet who tells me two things. And one is they had no idea how difficult and unnatural it would feel in the beginning. And the other is that they had no idea that it was not supposed to hurt. So those are the two big ones. And I think the whole business about being natural is we put so much focus in on the birth, and we just assume that breastfeeding is a natural thing to do, so it will come naturally. And when I have an opportunity to sit down and talk to a mom on an individual basis in a private consult, I try and because she's very frustrated, and I try and get her thinking, birth is a natural thing to do. And yet, we spend 9 months leading up to those 24, 36, 48 hours. We take classes that are 20 and 30 hours long, and we hire people to help us get through the birth. And that is something natural. And breastfeeding, I'd like for people to start thinking about it the same way. It's a natural thing, but it doesn't necessarily come naturally. And this thing, breastfeeding, isn't just 24, 36, 48 hours. It happens 8 or 9 times a day, times 7 days a week. So you've got 60 or 7 breastfeeds that very first week. And of course, the plan is to breastfeed for many, many, many months. And so when I am able to talk to a mom ahead of time, I try and get her in the mindset, because even if someone just mentions it a little bit, they're just still focused on the birth. And I think the birth is very, very important. But I also want them to think about what comes afterwards, is that you have a baby that you have to breastfeed. So I think years ago, it may have felt more natural to some moms if you were a little girl growing up in a household 2 or 3 generations ago, where it was part of the fabric of everyday life, that you saw your mother, your sister, your aunt, the girl across the street. We all lived in close proximity to each other, and women weren't covering up, and they were breastfeeding their babies. So part of it is that when it came your turn, you were used to seeing breasts and touching breasts and babies on breasts, and you were used to watching moms. And while nobody necessarily gave you specific instructions, a lot about what you were seeing was very, very familiar. And then it comes our turn. And I find lots of moms, we can buy pretty bras and we put the girls in them, and they're a sexual thing for the guys. But when it's their turn to breastfeed, some women aren't even used to touching their breasts. They don't, when we're in class, I talk about flat nipples or inverted nipples. And the funny thing is moms are like, oh, I don't know. And their partners are like, oh, yours definitely are reverted or flat or inverted or whatever. We're just not used to touching this part of our anatomy other than to put them in a bra. And so it's the assumption that it's a natural thing to do and we don't need to do anything to prepare for it is a very, very common myth. And then the next one is because it's natural, then moms just think it's not supposed to hurt. And or they think it's not supposed to hurt, but when it hurts, they then have girlfriends and mothers and physicians telling them, oh, yeah, it hurt me for like 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks. You just have to keep going, keep going, keep going, and eventually it will get better. So I think that I know that those are the two biggies, and I still stand by. If I had $1 for every mom that said that to me, I would be able to buy, like, I don't know, a nice condo in Maui or something fun like that.
Well, I loved what you said about because I hadn't really thought about it that way, which is kind of interesting. But you're so right. I mean, before I had my son, I took a prenatal class and a hypnobirthing class, and I watched all these videos about birth. And I really I read the book and I like the hypnobirthing book. I really prepared. And in the class, like my husband and I were practicing all the different positions to that you could birth in and all that stuff because we had the birth at home, and we gave it so much time and attention. And you're so right that birth is important, but I always say labor has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and then it's over, whereas breastfeeding goes on and on and on and on. And
Yes.
so I love what you said about having a world where we actually consider that and start to think about how to prepare. But so that brings me to my question, Lori, which is, how can you really prepare for breastfeeding?
The best way a mom can prepare is there are several things that she can do that I think could be of a huge value. The reality is you don't have what I call your breastfeeding partner to do this breastfeeding dance with there. You still have your baby in the belly. So you can't practice. What you can do, though, is to start getting in that frame of mind and start hanging out with other moms who are breastfeeding. And so I tell mothers, because they often feel like, well, I'm working and I'm not like in that world yet. It feels like a whole world away for them. And I explain to them, if you go to a La Leche League group or a breastfeeding mothers group from the birth center you're at or a community one, those women are like mother hens. There's nothing better that they love to see than a pregnant mom, her first time around, who wants to learn about breastfeeding. And you can sit in a room with other women who are latching their babies on. And most of them will not have a problem with you seeing what it is that they're doing. Most will not have a problem if you say, can I see that again? Can I see that in slow motion? Because most women have been in the spot where you are, where they didn't know and they were questioning. And a lot of the moms have also been in the position of having a very rough start with breastfeeding. And there's nothing better that they would love than to have you in their circle, in their group, watching breastfeeding and hearing them talk about what their very early latching on was like in their very early weeks. So you are getting into that mindset. So just like when you're taking hypnobirth classing and you're going to classes and you're listening to tapes, you're learning. You can't give birth yet, right? But you're learning about it and you're getting yourself into that mindset, which I think is huge. So doing that can be real help. And then the next thing is to take really good classes. And you will definitely hear me say that slant on really good classes, because I find that some classes, they just kind of like the classes that taught me how to be a good hospital patient in labor. There are some breastfeeding classes that just kind of skirt over everything. And, they make it sound like it's just beautiful and birds are singing and the sun is shining and your baby is going to be at the breast and everything's going to be beautiful. And I always say to moms, if that happens to you, embrace it, be thrilled about it. And that's your experience. If it's not, and you haven't been given some really good information, then you're kind of stuck without any tools in your toolbox, again, similar to labor. And so the classes that I like to give are ones that I'm really teaching parents what is it that is normal newborn breastfeeding behavior. What is it supposed to be like on the mom's side? and what is it supposed to be like on the baby side. So I find that lots of moms and dads and partners really have no idea what a baby's suckling rhythm is at the breast, what's normal, what's not normal. And so, just to give you just a little insight, like one of the things I teach in the class, and if your audience is listening and wants to do it with me, that's fine. If not, you can just listen. But I talk about when your baby latches on, we can't, again, practice that because you don't have your baby, but you can take your thumb and index finger in your left hand, and then you can take your index finger in your right hand, and you can take the two fingers on your left hand and open and close them on the tip of your index finger on your right hand. So you're basically squeezing the tip of your nipple and of your finger. And a mother's nipple is very, very sensitive, and it's typically a rounder shape. It's sticking out a little bit, and it's a rounder shape. And when you do that on your index finger, you open and close the opposite hand, the two fingers, the index and the thumb, and you do that 30 or 40 times, you start feeling like it's like pinch, 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 pinch. And when you stop doing it, you then see the misshapen of the tip of the index finger. And I tell parents now, it's probably not hurting you yet because you've just done it for 30, 40 times, maybe a minute's worth. But when a baby's breastfeeding, that will go on for 20 or 30 minutes on each side, and it will happen many times a day. Just think if you treated your finger like that, hundreds of rotations of squeezing and pinching it, the next day, if you go to do that again, you're going to be like, ow, that's kind of tender and sore. And if you keep doing it another day, it's going to be, oh my goodness, that's painful. So one of the things I try and teach parents is that when your baby latches on, it should not feel pinch, pinch, or a bitey sensation. It should feel more like your finger is sliding back and forth, or a tug that's back and forth, and that it should be painless. So that's just one example of some of the things that I could share with parents about what it's supposed to feel like, because I meet with so many parents days and days later, and their baby is just like pinching their nipple like crazy. And again, so many mothers will say, I had no idea what it was supposed to feel like, and yeah, my baby's been pinching from that very first latch. Had I known that was not normal, I might have asked for help, but I didn't know. So I can give parents a lot of really good tips about what they should expect, how certain things should be, and how they shouldn't be. And I talk to them about nutritive sucking. So like today, for instance, almost each one of my consults, my private consults today, the babies were literally mostly just sleeping at the breast. And when I asked moms how often your baby is feeding, and do you feel like your baby is awake and active on their own, or you're needing to kind of nudge them, some parents say, oh yeah, but, baby's feeding for like 20 or 30 minutes. And what they're doing is looking at the clock. And as long as their baby is opening and closing, even just a little baby bit, they think their baby is eating and transferring milk. And I get to point out to them, I use my fingers a lot. I have a cloth breast model in class, and then I show videos. And I show them the jaw should be open and closed, very wide, open and closed, and in a rhythm. And I talk about the rhythm. So by the time parents leave a class with me, they know it's not supposed to be pinchy. They know their babies are supposed to be awake and active, and on the outside what the nutritive sucking is supposed to look like. And I also do my best to motivate them that if these things are happening, to get help sooner rather than later, because the pinchiness stuff means they're going to be hurting the nipples and making them worse. And it also means that the milk transfer will be typically very little. And I talk to them a lot about don't focus so much on the clock and timing it. What I care about is what is your baby doing during the time that they are at the breast. So seeing other moms breastfeed is huge, and taking a really good class that's not just going to skirt over the issue, tell you the benefits to mothers and babies, and make it all sound like it's this beautiful, exciting thing that we can't wait for you to do, which it is. but none of that will help you if you're help you in preventing problems or help you assess on your own if you feel like you need help. So that's just two examples.
Lori, that is incredible. So for the listeners who have not had a baby, are maybe trying to conceive, or maybe are pregnant, what Lori just shared is so valuable. And I mean, it's hard to know how valuable until you find yourself with your baby and you're breastfeeding in those first couple days. But trust me when I say you'll be thankful that you heard that description of what it's like, because that was, first of all, those are some really great ways to prepare. Because to be honest with you, I asked that question because I thought to myself, how can you really prepare? And then as soon as you started talking, it kind of came back to me that after I ran into trouble with my own breastfeeding journey, I was scouring everywhere I could to find information, to educate myself on what a latch is supposed to look like and how a baby looks when they're eating, and to understand what is normal and what isn't and all those types of things. So for moms who don't get that education ahead of time, you end up getting like a crash course, but by then your breasts are sore, all kinds of stuff is going wrong. And it's super stressful to try to learn all of that stuff when you have a baby that needs to eat every 2 hours. And so yes. I love your just description of how to prepare in advance for that.
And can I add a couple of things that
please.
Just came to mind? Mm-hmm. So the other thing is to assume ahead of time that you're going to need help. And what that will do is motivate you before your baby is born to find people in your community who, if you're having a problem with breastfeeding, you've perhaps already met them, or you've already been on their website, you know how to locate them, you can tell your partner to locate them. So again, we do a lot again for the birth, and what I'm asking parents to do is think about breastfeeding in the same way. Gather all your resources as much as you can ahead of time. Because if you're having problems afterwards, like you said, Lisa, you were then on this mission to go on the internet or books and start figuring out what's going on and how you can fix it. And yet you have a baby that's crying every couple of hours and you're in pain. So it's like the worst time to try and start to do research. And especially when we're pregnant the first time, we may not really realize it, but you actually do you certainly have more time then than you will have after the baby is born, and your frame of mind will be better. And so what I try and do is talk to parents about what to expect to prevent it, and then how do they know when it's not going well. And then I'm just this huge, strong supporter and pusher to get help much sooner rather than later. And the other misconception is that for some people is that help with breastfeeding, that insurance companies will pay for it, the government will pay for it, the hospital will pay for it. And so there are barriers to breastfeeding and getting help after you have your baby, and one of them is money. And money is tight for most people, and yet you're having a baby. It's going to cost you some degree of money. And if breastfeeding is what you really want and it's not going well, and you're starting to give formula, once you get through the free formula that's been given you by the formula companies, you're going to have to spend money for it. So I tell parents, you're going to have to spend money one way or the other to feed your baby. And you need to decide, do you want to spend money on formula, or do you want to spend money on someone helping you so that you can do what your heart desires and provide breast milk for your baby? So one of the other very important tips that I give moms in my breastfeeding class is I tell them, during your pregnancy, just start to put $10 a week aside, or however much money you feel like you can. And if you're able to, by the time you give birth, if you're able to have put aside $150 in an envelope, don't let money be a barrier to you calling someone and paying for help, because now you know you have that money put aside in an envelope. And on the other side of that coin is, if breastfeeding is going really well, guess what? You have that money put aside, and it could be date night. You can get a massage. You can go out for a nice dinner. You know, you can put that money back in the bank if you want to. But if you prepare for it, with, again, seeing people, learning about it, and then putting money aside, you've pretty much got yourself covered for what may happen after the birth as far as getting help.
Well, and I loved your suggestion initially as well to go to your local La Leche League and just, hang out with moms who are breastfeeding, and then you have the opportunity to talk to the lactation consultant. Because the interesting thing is, maybe not for everyone depending on where you live, but you can always do a search online for La Leche League group, and you might be surprised to find that there are women meeting near you. I know there are women who meet weekly by me, and I only figured that out after I ran into trouble with breastfeeding. And so that's a really great idea to actually show up when you're pregnant, just to kind of get your head around it. And one of the things that I remember learning in the process is, for a first-time mom, the baby doesn't know what they always say that. I don't know, Lori, you'll have to correct me if that's something that you talk to your clients about, but I remember someone sharing that with me. They're like, well, the baby doesn't really know what they're doing, so you kind of have to guide the baby in terms of this whole breastfeeding thing. But then when you're a first-time mom, you don't know what you're doing either. So you not really know what you're doing, and the baby doesn't really know what they're doing, because they don't necessarily come out just like perfectly latched in this, like, they have to kind of figure it out too.
Right. I call it learning how to do this breastfeeding waltz together. And when you have one partner who's on the East Coast and the other partner who's on the West Coast, and you're both learning how to do the waltz separately, great and wonderful. You say you both even know how to do it really well. But now we're bringing you together and we're having you waltz together. Well, you're going to kind of be fumbling and stepping on each other's toes, and there's a lot of start and stops until you kind of figure out your rhythm with this other human being. And so even if there's nothing in the way, like you had a baby with tongue ties, so probably no matter how well you latched your baby on or how well you did this breastfeeding dance together, it was still going to kill your nipples because you had something bigger going on. But even if you don't, it still just takes a while for mom and baby to kind of find their rhythm together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that. And I want to stress that kind of, I really liked what you said about kind of think of it as though you will need support. Have those numbers, those resources ready, because the one thing that I did learn about breastfeeding is that it's also a very acute situation. When your baby is screaming for food, it's not something that can wait a week for an appointment with somebody. You need an appointment right now. You need someone to come to your house today. And you can't even wait 6 hours, because in 6 hours you have to feed your baby 3 more times. So it's quite an acute kind of time sensitive scenario. And so what I want to delve into a little bit, we've kind of touched on some of the challenges that moms might face with breastfeeding. And of course, not to paint the picture that all moms have these horrible problems with breastfeeding, but to talk about the reality of it, which is that many moms do. So what are some of the reasons why women have difficulties breastfeeding? Maybe you could go into what a tongue tie is for some of the listeners who don't know what that is, but maybe share some of the kind of common challenges that new moms face.
Okay, so let's talk about some of the common ones. So let's just say that you have the perfect setup and you have a normal, healthy mom who gives birth at full term to a healthy baby. There's no oral issues like high palates or tongue tie. There are no issues that are to be concerned about with mom's breast or nipple anatomy, and she's not going to have any problems with milk supply. So the foundation is really good. What happens in those scenarios, which is probably about 60% of the time, is that as new mothers, and I know I was there too, like my baby, like Alicia, was like a little China doll. And I was afraid to hold her too close, too tight, too anything. And so when I brought her to the breast, I actually babysat a lot before, and I gave a lot of babies bottles. And I pretty much brought Alicia to the breast the same way that I would bottle feed a baby. And so she was laying flat on her back with her belly button and her eyes towards the ceiling. And then she would smell the milk. I'd bring her to the breast, and what she would need to do is turn her head over her neck. And if your listeners just do that with me now, when we're drinking, we're facing the cup or bottle, and then we're lifting our chin up and we're opening wide to take a gulp. Well, if you had to turn your head over your neck to the left side and then bring your chin down, and yet the bottle is above you or the cup is above you, you're all contorted. So lots of times what moms are doing is they're just latching their babies on in very awkward positions, and they need to turn their babies facing them. They also, and this is a really cool part, again, if you were a girl growing up in a household, you would witness these babies opening up really wide, shaking their head from side to side, and then their moms quickly bringing their baby onto the breast. And what I find women typically do with their first baby is we're so soft and so gentle. And our baby, as soon as they open their mouth with just a little birdie mouth, we're bringing them on. And what do they grab? They basically latch on to just the nipple. And that's where they're spending their time. And that is a very, very, very common situation. And that can turn pretty acute in a very short period of time, because if the baby is suckling on the tender nipple, that nipple is going to crack at a certain point and then begin to bleed. And that is going to have her pain level very high, sometimes within 24, 36, or 48 hours of the birth. And so, again, that's very, given a normal situation, that's a very common reason why women have problems in the early days. And again, in the classes that I teach, I talk about turn the baby towards them, and we go over everything that the position and latch, except for just actually is one of the very common things that happen. The other thing that happens a lot is moms and dads, and sometimes it's grandparents are around, and sometimes it's physicians, have very strict rules about their baby's feeding habits. It's either something that the parents have just assumed themselves. Sometimes they read it in a book, and sometimes they were told by someone else. But the feeling that their baby should only eat every X amount of hours. So commonly it's either every 3 hours, and that they should breastfeed from one side only, or breastfeed from both sides for 10 minutes. So they start putting a lot of rules around scheduling their baby's feeding times and timing them at the breast. And that is a huge setup for making breastfeeding very, very, very difficult. So again, we take something that's normal and natural, and we ignore the cues that our babies are giving us, and we start following what anybody else but the baby is telling us. And that is a setup for sore nipples, low supply, poor milk transfer, poor weight gain. And a lot of this happens in the first 3 or 4 days of a baby's life. And then typically you go to your pediatrician for a checkup, and then you find out on day 4 or 5 that your baby has lost too much weight. And then you're told to start supplementing and or pumping and giving your milk in a bottle. And then everything changes and becomes that much more challenging, which I work with this all the time. And mothers, through their hard work and perseverance, motivation, and good partner support, do get through it. But what I like to do is, what can I do to help you prevent getting to this point? So there's just a lot of information that is poor information, poor breastfeeding management that is just given from one woman to the next, to the next, to the next. And like I said, sometimes it's just what mothers think, and sometimes it's what they're read and what they're told.
Well, and the education piece is so huge. And as we're having this conversation, I just feel like it can benefit women so much to have a bit of education around breastfeeding. And one of the problems with our belief that it's natural is that we kind of assume then that there's not a whole lot to it. You just put the baby on the breast and that's it. And as soon as you actually start breastfeeding a human being, you realize that it's so like you could write an entire, like people have written books on it, but you could write several. You could write an encyclopedia about it. And people have made their whole careers. Jack Newman is an amazing resource for breastfeeding moms. His website, there's videos. And through that education, what you had said initially about pinching. And so you educate mothers that it's not supposed to hurt. And if it's pinching from the very beginning, that means that there's something wrong. And then you went on to describe that some babies just kind of grab onto the nipple. Well, if you think about it, for a mom who has not really seen breastfeeding a whole lot, and even if she has, but for a first-time mom, you don't really know what breastfeeding is supposed to look like. I mean, you see your breasts get kind of bigger and swollen as you get pregnant, or as you go through your pregnancy and everything, but you don't really know what that's supposed to look like. And so it's kind of surprising to me to discover that when your baby suckles on the breast, they're not just sucking on the nipple. The nipple is supposed to go all the way into the mouth and actually end up at the top of their mouth. So they draw in way more of the breast into their mouth than you would have ever thought. Like that was my experience. I'd never thought that, I never thought of it, but I didn't realize how much of the breast that goes into the baby's mouth with a proper latch, for example. And that makes a huge difference.
There's lots of examples and analogies, but I remember this is why I related a lot to birth, because there are so many things about birth. Like I remember when I was pregnant for the first time and I was like 2 months and I saw this very pregnant woman try and go through a turnstile. And she was like trying to figure out what she should do with her belly because it wasn't quite fitting in the right place. And there was a part of her like put her two hands under and cupped her belly and almost like lifted it to try and get through. And I remember saying to my husband, well, I'm never going to get that big. Like how is my belly possibly going to get that big? And so, but we have this stuff that happens gradually during pregnancy. And so we have an opportunity to adjust to it. And when we give birth, within 2 or 3 days, if things are working the way that they're supposed to, our breasts are like foreign objects all of a sudden. They're like huge. And we're having all these tingly sensations and they're leaking. So we're leaking from above and our breasts are very different and we're bleeding vaginally and we're sleep deprived and we're emotional. And that's the thing, is like we're trying to learn this whole big new thing that's so incredibly important that now becomes the focus of your every waking hour to nourish your baby. And if it's not going well, it can bring on major high anxiety. But one of the points that I wanted to make on that is that we adjust to things during pregnancy and during birth. It's fairly quick in comparison. And just like you said, once you have your baby, all of a sudden you have all of these things happening. And how are you then supposed to try and figure out what to do, who's going to help you? How do you even know what's wrong? How do you even know? You have to figure out what's wrong first before you can figure out how to fix it. And we are in probably the worst place emotionally and physically to try and figure this out on our own.
Mm-hmm. It's so true. And so I would love for you to kind of paint a picture of what is normal. And so there's a lot of misconceptions, and you touched on that idea that, I mean, one of the things then that moms, do when we're preparing for a baby is, run out and buy a whole bunch of books. And so as soon as you start reading the books, one of my girlfriends, she has 4 children, 2 older, 2 younger. And it's so funny because then when I was pregnant and everything, and you're at your shower and people are giving advice and like, oh, what's your best tip for me? I mean, obviously you have 4 kids, so you know a little bit more about this mom thing than I do. And she was like, don't read the books. Don't read them at all. And I remember with my first, I kind of thought, oh, well, I'm still going to read a couple. And then with my second, I was like, oh, I totally get why you said that. And so when you read the books, and not that there's anything wrong with education. So obviously I'm all about education, but it can give you this idea that your life with your new baby is going to be kind of structured. Like your baby's going to eat, at this time, and then they're going to take a nap, and then they're, or they just give you this idea that you can create this structured day with your kids, like from day one with your baby. And so you touched on that when you said that there's a misconception there about thinking that you could feed your baby every 3 hours and then it's just going to be neat and tidy, when it doesn't work like that. So maybe you can paint us a picture of those first couple of weeks, how much baby eats, what that's like.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is one of the things when I say a good breastfeeding class, I often think, and I actually say to the couple sometimes, this is going to sound like a Debbie Downer, because I'm going to talk about all things that you probably don't want to hear and you didn't think were going to happen. And if breastfeeding is going really well for you, here's how it will look. And I will talk to them about that. And that's a quicker conversation. And if it's not looking like that, here are some of the common things that happen. And here's how you will know that it's not going normally. So a bulk of the class is talking about problems that moms have, how to detect that you're having them, how to see if you could help yourself at home. And I also put like timelines around that. Like if the next 2 or 3 feedings doesn't fix this, you want to call for help. And so I really say that I am a pain in the tush because, again, we have this whole pregnancy and all the time, money, and energy that's spent in reading up about pregnancy and taking classes and et cetera. And what I tell moms is if you spend 1 to 2 hours with an IBCLC after you have your baby, in a good class before and after you have your baby, you will learn so much that it's just so well worth it. So when breastfeeding is going really well, you will be putting your baby to the breast and there will be no pain. You will put your baby to the breast and you'll see that your baby will be having this very wide open and closed. And Jack Newman that you mentioned, and you could put links, he has some really good videos of babies that are breastfeeding really well. We call that nutritive sucking. And babies that are just kind of hanging out, non-nutritive sucking, not really doing much at the breast. That is so crucial for parents to learn the difference. That is like the foundation of breastfeeding. And everything else springs from good position, good latch, and how do I know that my baby is transferring milk normally? And so I talk to them about this is what your baby should be doing. And we're not timing it so much, but I'm giving parents some parameters, like an average newborn might be feeding 8 or 9 times a day, but it's not hurting. Your nipple does not pinch when they come off. And most of the time when they're done, they'll be pretty happy campers. And then I talk about the normal output that a baby has. So we go through this whole thing. Does it feel comfortable? Is my baby have this nutritive sucking? When my baby comes off, do my nipples look normal? And is my baby having the correct amount of output? And by day 3 or day 4, we then get to add something else to that piece. We say, now my breasts are full with milk. When my baby's done, are my breasts much softer? And is my baby looking satiated? And do the pees continue to come at a normal rate? And the stools, are they yellow mustardy now by day 4? So we can give like very specific signs about their baby's output, what's supposed to happen. And all of this happens between day 1 and day 4. So most parents should be able to figure out by the 4th day, is it comfortable? Is my baby satiated, meaning pretty full after most feedings? Do my nipples not hurting before, during, or after? Now that my volume of milk is in, is my baby having good suckling activity and softening my breasts up a whole bunch? And by day 4, are we having 2 to 3 yellow mustardy stools and 4 healthy wet diapers every day? And that's a really good start. And if they're getting that, then they know that they're off to a pretty good start. It's usually when things aren't going well, there'll be one of those things or more. Usually it's cumulative or not happening. Their nipples are sore, their nipples are pinched, they start to get cracked or bleeding, their babies are really not productively feeding in that nutritive fashion, and the output is not what it's supposed to be. So there are early signs that they can tell. Is it going well and is it not? And this, I understand this. This rolls off my tongue very easily because I talk about it all the time. And for your listeners, it will be like a bundle of information, especially if they've never breastfed before. And I can talk about it afterwards, but I am going to give some information where they can go to my website, and I have an area, it's called freebies, where I have like 4 checklists. How do I know breastfeeding is going well? Signs that it's not going well? What do the early days of breastfeeding look like? And so there are 4 handouts that are really helpful, so you don't have to remember everything from this conversation. But for the most part, it should be fairly easy. It shouldn't be hurting. Your baby should be happy and full after feedings and have the appropriate amount of output. And actually, breastfeeding. What I find a lot is babies are mostly sleeping at the breasts, and their moms just don't know that because they've never really been up close and personal and seen a newborn breastfeed. And when it's going well, you are still a very tired mommy, but you are not one in pain and not feeling anxious about, is your baby getting enough? Because you're learning the signs of how to tell that they are.
Well, and I think we're kind of a bottle-fed culture, and so the bottle is super helpful in that you can see exactly how many ounces your baby is eating. And so for more of that type A, I want to control, I want to know what's going on exactly. I want to make sure that everything is going the way it should, like it in the book, right? Like the book said. So a bottle makes that really easy. Obviously with the breast, there's no way to measure exactly how much they're getting. I mean, unless you're going to go to the length of like weighing your baby before and after feeding. And so, I guess just to allow, like, just to kind of talk a little bit about that, I think one of the challenges that new moms face is kind of like that. I don't know. I would say, and so Lori, again, you tell me if this is something you've seen. It's kind of like a confidence thing where you worry because as a new mom, you worry a lot about your baby. Is your baby getting enough to eat? So you wonder, do I have enough milk? And you wonder, especially if your baby is kind of, feeding every couple hours, right? Because your baby's asking for more milk all the time. You start to wonder, do I have enough milk? So, one of the things that I remember, in the Jack Newman information on his website, he talks about that and how he would say that most of the time it's not an issue of milk, like not having enough. But what has your experience been like for moms that are worried and afraid that they don't have enough milk?
Well, you're right. It's a confidence builder. And here again, we come from watching other mothers breastfeed, asking them questions, taking a good class. And I thought I designed checklists because I understand that. And the checklist I designed were really based on exactly what you're saying. Mothers are like, it's not this invisible container. I can't measure it. I don't know. So what I've done is give them a checklist that they can go by and say, but they need to know what normal is. So once they learn what normal nutritive sucking is, they can start looking, is my baby sucking, doing normal nutritive sucking? Is my baby being productive at the breast? And they visually have learned the signs. We've talked about it, and they've watched videos on it. And no, are they 100% sure of it? No, but a lot more than not having looked at any videos and just assumed that they would know. So they're asking themselves, is it hurting? No. Do I feel any pinching? No. Do I feel my nipple tugging and sliding back and forth comfortably in the baby's mouth? Yes. How is my baby looking during feedings? Do I need to keep nudging my baby because my baby keeps falling asleep? Or is my baby just power nursing? My baby's power nursing, very active and very interested. how does my nipple look when the baby comes off? Because before the fourth day, before you have a lot of volume, you can't add that other piece of a full breast and then a soft breast. That's when moms start to get more confident, when they can add the full and soft breast. But before that, they can check off that list, and they can also check off every pee and poopy diaper, and they could watch the transition from dark black meconium to a lighter brown to the yellow mustardy. So part of it is them trusting that they've learned enough, they have their checklist, and that's what they're going by. And then for them to tell themselves if there's anything that's swaying from that checklist, if they are saying it's painful, if they are saying my baby's mostly sleeping, if they are saying my baby hasn't peed in 2 whole days, that highlights to them that you know what, you do have a reason to be concerned about and anxious and get help. And so I find that checklists help a lot when we can't see what's going in. And then after day 4, day 5, we get to add a few other things to that. It makes it easier. But still, some parents just, they keep needing to do that checklist for almost every feeding. And slowly they start seeing their baby gain the weight. They start seeing their baby fill out. And then there's a trust that comes just between the mom and the baby and the breast. And they kind of take off and run with it. But it's understandable, and it would not be unusual for the first couple of days, literally to at least 2 or 3 weeks, for most of us to still be unsure. And it's knowing what we should expect and being able to follow that checklist is one of the things that can really help. And the other thing that I really try and talk to parents about, you touched on it before, and it's this whole notion of how many times our baby is supposed to feed, and the books tell you one thing. And what I try and get parents in the mindset and thinking, your baby may not feed exactly 8 times, exactly 3 hours apart. You need to start, part of the newborn parenting stuff is learning how to read your baby's cues. But some people get so structured. And so I have parents think about it. So like in class, I have them write down, if they could go over the last day, every time they remember putting something in their mouth. So they might have 3 meals, they have a few snacks, and guess what? They're drinking a lot. They're drinking 5 and 6 and 7 8-ounce glasses of water or fluid. At that point, they're now putting 15 to 20 times something in their mouth. And I tell them, well, what would it be like if I just said you could have breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and you have any snacks then, and you have any drinks then, and that's it, because I've decided how much you should eat and when you should eat. How will that feel? And almost everybody says, well, I wouldn't like that. And I talk to couples about, well, what if he drags you out of bed because it's Sunday morning and he's ready to eat, but what if you're not? What if you're both not hungry at the same time, but you're made to eat at the same time? And if you don't, well, then you have to forsake that meal. And so I get people to start thinking about even their own habits. They're kind of all over the place. They certainly don't want anybody telling them when they should eat or drink and have a snack. And so I talk to them about trying to learn their baby's cues and to be respectful. Their baby, like we're big people and their baby is little people. And I want them to try and start respecting these little people who are trying to teach you how to take care of them. And when we start looking externally at the books and physicians and websites and grandmas and not really look at what's right in front of us, that's when we go down a really hard path. So I really get people to try and think about trying to learn your baby's cues, and I just like right out there and tell them, and you'll be wrong half of the time, but it's a learning experience. And to trust that if they just take their time and watch their baby, that in a very, very short time, I don't know how you felt about this, Lisa, but you go from like, I don't know what this little being is trying to tell me, to a month later, you're like, oh no, that's a cry. That means he wants that. That's a face. That means he's about to poop. That's a, you know what I mean? Like you wouldn't believe or you know what clothes even he like. He likes snaps, but he doesn't like zippers. You know so much more about your baby 4 weeks later than you knew the first day that he was born. It's astounding, isn't it?
It completely is. Well, and that brings me like exactly into the question I want to ask you. So before we get into the final questions of the day, I wanted you to talk about what you call the sweet spot. And, we've talked a lot about the challenges that moms face when they're breastfeeding, especially in those first couple days. It can be so brutal. And it can also not be, but it's good to know the reality of it. But not to scare off the mums, there is a point if you're able to make it through the challenges, and they can be really hard. And that's why we've stressed needing support, because I would never understate how difficult it can be and how painful it can be if you do have a problem. It's so painful. And it just goes on and on and on. Like I said, birth, beginning, middle, and end, breastfeeding, on and on and on. But with that being said, there comes a point with breastfeeding where it is just like putting on your shoes. Like it's like you don't think about it, you barely feel anything. Like it's like anything else in life. Like it's literally as nonchalant as putting on a t-shirt. And so, Lori, I would love for you to tell us a little bit about the sweet spot.
Yes, I would love to do that. So I'm actually thinking of a mom. I'll just name her Susie, but a mom that I saw today that really helps to illustrate it. I met her during the last part of her pregnancy and in a breastfeeding class. Then after her baby was born, we met when her baby was 4 days old. She had a baby at home. And she called and said, things are actually going pretty good along all your checklists, but I still have questions and I still feel comfortable with you coming out to the house and just talking about a lot of things. There's still some things I'm not sure about. And so I came to her house, and it's not that she had totally reached her sweet spot, but she is one of the many moms I meet. As much as I meet moms who start off with really hard times, I also work with moms who start off fairly easy. They just kind of get into the groove of breastfeeding and they're not really having any problems, but it's still a big, big adjustment. Sitting and feeding a baby 8 or 9 times a day for a half hour to an hour each time. And when your baby's born, you still have questions. So we went over a lot of her questions. And when we were done, she said to me, I really wasn't having much problems, and I didn't really think so, but just sitting here, you adjusted the latch just a little bit. And I really didn't realize that it was kind of an annoying feeling. It wasn't painful. But now that you did that, now I realize that is the sweet spot where the baby should be. My nipples should be very far back. And now I've gone from being pretty okay to, oh my goodness, I don't feel a thing. And I have to look down and actually see that the baby is nursing. And from talking to her about the questions that she had and having her husband in the room, because there were some issues that they both had about sleeping and waking the baby up. And even though they read things and knew things, they were still getting all this input from relatives who frequently stay with parents when they have a baby. So they have that input. And it's very easy to succumb to all this outside stuff, even though we've kind of learned something different because these are our elders and they've learned more, they've been around more. So I helped to clarify a lot, and she was doing pretty well. And then I saw her today again because she was starting to she actually had some issues of oversupply, so she was making too much milk. And so nothing was a crisis, but she said, you know what, I've asked you a few questions online. I'd really like to meet with you. So we met, and when we met, though, now it was her baby was 6 weeks old, and I was talking to her. She was really in that sweet spot from probably the time after when I came to visit her at 3 or 4 days old. She said, because she said where she was going after our appointment. And I said, oh, wow, you're going to your friend's house and you're going this. I said, where else have you been with the baby? He's only 6 weeks old. And she starts telling me all of these other places that she's been and that she's done. So she had her sweet spot very early on. And some moms, it takes them longer. And when I mean that, I'm like, they are in the breastfeeding zone. They are cruising along. And that is when breastfeeding is just a part of the rhythm of everyday life. You're not necessarily having to sit down and think about how you're holding your baby, hold your breast, purposefully latch your baby on, get a pillow and a stool or a wrap, something to cover you. You just don't really have to think about it anymore. And that real sweet spot, which this mom already reached at 6 weeks of age, is she said, I just have baby and boob and go. Like, I really don't have to, I have a small diaper bag that I have diaper change stuff and some extra pair of clothes, but I'm not thinking about breastfeeding all day, every day, like I did in the beginning, even though she wasn't having a tough time. So it just really becomes part of your life, and you recognize the incredible convenience of it when it's going well, because you don't have to worry about refrigeration, bottles, heating things. As soon as your baby cries and is showing any signs of hunger, you just basically pop your baby on and all's good in the world. If you go out to the mall, you go with friends and your baby's a little fussy, there's no trying to figure out things. And, for a breastfeeding mom to figure out, where do I find a private place to sit and feed my baby? How do I cover up? How do I get my baby fed? And that sweet spot is you are just so comfortable with everything that you're not thinking about how to get my baby fed. You are just doing it, and you are not even thinking about it. That's, to me, when you're really cruising along in this sweet spot. And if it takes a mom 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 10 weeks, that's all good. It's all within the normal. But it's just, the sweet spot is, man, this is just incredibly convenient. And that's what I love when women get to that point, because they really do reap the benefits of the very early days. Even if it was going smooth and they weren't having any pain or problems, it's pretty intense those first few weeks, because you have a new baby and you're learning about each other and you're recovering from the birth process and you're emotional. And then all of a sudden you just get to this point where it's all just a no-brainer and it's really easy schmeezy.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I think that is such an important point to kind of bring our conversation to, like, to kind of give the full arc, because I mean, those first couple days can be just, I would say, like, tongue in cheek, it's like you're at war. Like, it's just all of a sudden, it's so hard. With my first baby, the first couple of days was just so trying for me, but that's because we had some significant breastfeeding challenges and all those things. And it was so just like every 2 hours, the baby's, he's crying. He really wants milk. I was having problems with the latch and it was hurting. And so then I'd have to take him off and he's crying more. And there's just so much stuff going on. And it took me about, say, 8 weeks to get to my sweet spot. So it doesn't mean we weren't breastfeeding throughout that whole time, but the sweet spot for me was when there's no more pain, there's no more challenges, just like you said, you don't have to think about it. And then the really sweet spot is when your baby's, old enough, big enough to start kind of latching themselves, where you don't have to manipulate their head or anything. Like, you just basically put them in front of the boob and then they go for it.
I know. I say it's like you just sit down and they're just like on, like, all of a sudden.
Yeah.
And sometimes
you don't even have to look.
You don't even have to look. And sometimes the husbands, when I speak to some of the husbands and the partners, they're like, I used to, like, it was this whole big thing we had to go through.
Oh yeah, and you have the breastfeeding pillow. Like, I had
right.
I had to buckle it to myself because I had one of the specific breastfeeding pillows, because it has to be firm. And it's really helpful and useful when you have a newborn, because with a newborn you have to literally hold them, and it can actually, like, your newborn isn't heavy, but hold them for half an hour and then tell me they're not heavy, right? So you have this whole setup, and then you're also maybe not so comfortable with it, obviously, because you've never done it before. So then there's the covering and the this and the that and the other, and it's like a whole procedure.
And yes, and talking about when it becomes easy and convenient, one of the other things that I'd love for listeners to realize is that when we are talking about some of the hard times initially, that I'm telling you, I don't know about you, Lisa, but there was nothing better than sitting with your baby on your lap, nursing, and just like looking at them and cuddling them and playing with their hair and their fingers as they feed. And that's even at 3 or 4 months old. And when they get to be 6 months old, sometimes it's been a pretty busy day, and maybe you've been out shopping at the mall, or moms are out working, and then they come home and they sit in their chair and they put their baby onto the breast, and that is when the birds are singing and the sun is shining. It is just like such an incredible, loving, feel good, like I want to bottle this up feeling. And it's a great way to relax with your baby. And I always loved when it gets to that point with each one of my babies where it's not something that you have to do. It's something that you enjoy doing and that you literally look forward to do, and look forward to do frequently. And because it makes you feel good and it calms your baby. And then we can, there's a whole bunch of other stuff as the babies get older. If they start toddling and they fall down and then they cry, oh my goodness, just to be able to put them to the breast and calm all their fears and their crying because they bump their head. It is just like this, like I am woman, hear me roar kind of stuff. Like look at what I could do. And we haven't even touched on watching your baby fill out and get rolls and realize that you are the reason why they are gaining this weight and growing and developing and incredibly healthy. There's just so much more to it. We were just talking about the mechanics, but there's just so much love and enjoyment with breastfeeding when it gets easy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And of course, the science nerd in me has to say that when you're breastfeeding, it stimulates the baby suckling stimulates the release of oxytocin, the love hormone. And so it's quite literally this like Mother Nature's way of helping you bond with your baby. And you actually do feel like a kind of this warm, fuzzy, lovey feeling when you're breastfeeding your baby. So there's so much more to it, just like you said. And I just wanted to kind of give that bit of hope. Like there can be struggles in the beginning. If you're able to get the support that you need when you need it, then you can get through that part of it and get to the point where it's just part of your day and you don't really think about it. So I'm so happy that you shared that. And just to end the interview today, I mean, we've talked about so many different things, but what is one thing that you would want the listeners to take from our conversation today?
I think a couple of things. And one is, I just can't say it enough. And the reason we talk about getting help is we have an 85% breastfeeding initiation rate, which means 85% of mothers now are saying, I want to breastfeed, and they're starting off breastfeeding. Well, 1 week later, that's literally cut in half. And it doesn't mean that only 40% are exclusively breastfeeding. What means is that 40% are now combining, they're supplementing, they're breast pumping, they're bottle feeding. So all of a sudden, 40% are not doing what they initially intended to do, which was to exclusively breastfeed their baby. And by 3 months, only about 35% of moms are exclusively breastfeeding their baby. It's a huge, huge, huge drop off, which we want to avoid. And that's why what brings me to my next point is assume that you're going to need help. Put money aside and just get the help that you need. There's nothing to be ashamed about. Moms will frequently say, if they get past the point of, I didn't know that I would need help, and I feel like it's a natural thing to do, and it's embarrassing to ask for help. And so I would just love for you to know that it's a sign of strength to know, you know what, I do need help with this situation. And let me get the help that I need so I can move past this and get on with our life. So obviously, I'm a huge proponent for seeking help and not staying home. Because when you stay home and you're trying to make things better on your own day in, day out, a week later, your baby's dropped a lot of weight and your milk supply can suffer. So if I could really say one thing to moms, it is all the reasons why you should educate yourself ahead of time and put get your resources ahead of time, share them with your significant other, where if you want help after breastfeeding, you want to be able to pinpoint to them who they should call, what internet site they should go to hire an OBCLC, and point them to that envelope and say, see, we have the money. We don't have to be concerned. We have the money and I have the person and I'm not sitting home. I'm getting help.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And I'm so glad that you said that. And so I guess thinking of what the last question should be, because we've covered so many great topics today, but I guess I'll just end on the note. What's the biggest myth about breastfeeding that you think is out there that you'd like to see corrected?
The biggest myth is really what you started off with. We're going to come full circle. And as long as I'm doing this work, and I've been in IBCLC for 16, 18 years, but I've been involved in breastfeeding for many more, is this whole business that it's a natural thing to do. And so it'll just come naturally. And I really don't need to think too much about it. I'll wait for my baby to be born, and babies know how to do this thing. That's probably, that's not only the biggest myth, but it's also the biggest barrier for successful breastfeeding.
Okay. Well, Lori, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing your wisdom. For any of the listeners who are now dying to learn more about breastfeeding, make sure to check out Lori's podcast, All About Breastfeeding, the place where the girls hang out. And so, of course, I'll link to that in the show notes page. And Lori, maybe you can share with the listeners where they can go for more information about what you do and also those freebies that you were talking about.
Yes, they can go to allaboutbreastfeeding.biz, and that's my website. And just, look on the top and you can read the blogs. I do Skype interviews, especially prenatally for moms. It can really help answer some of the questions that they have about breastfeeding before their baby is born. You can find out a lot on my website. The exact place to go to for the freebies, which I'd love for everybody to check out, you just go to allaboutbreastfeeding.biz/freebies, and then you will see there are sections, and one of them is going back to work. I talk about pumping and storing, but the very top section, you will see there are 4 pages that you can download. Very handy handouts that I wish every woman who's breastfeeding, especially the first time, had access to these handouts, because this will really be their guidelines for the very early days and help to boost their confidence so that they can figure out, is this going well or not?
Well, Lori, I wish that before I had given birth to my first son, that I would have had you there to just tell me the importance of educating myself beforehand and really preparing for breastfeeding. So thank you so much for sharing that message with the audience and for providing those resources as well to help support the new moms that are going to need it when they start to breastfeed.
You are so very welcome, Lisa. I am thrilled to be able to share this information with you and your audience.
Oh, well, thanks again. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please share it with a friend. You'll find the show notes page for today's episode at fertilityfriday.com/118. I hope you enjoyed that interview with Lori. I was so excited to have her on the show and talk about breastfeeding. I really enjoyed the interview that I did with her on her podcast. And so, like I mentioned, I'm going to link that interview to the show notes page so that you can go and take a listen. And it was a great interview. It's interesting reflecting on my breastfeeding journey about, let's say, 3.5, almost 4 years from when I first started breastfeeding my eldest son. And, as I shared on the podcast, it was a really challenging time for me. It was just, I didn't expect at all for that to even be a thing. I was super engaged with the birth process. I had planned to have a home birth and I put a lot of energy planning that. And I'm really glad that I did, because it really helped for me to have that knowledge about hypnobirthing. And I delivered my son at home in his bedroom in a birthing pool. And I had a midwife supporting me, and that it was intentional. I know some people ask, was that on purpose that you had it at home or you didn't make it to the hospital? But it was intentional. And so planning that process and really going through the education, the hypnobirthing class that I took was really informative. It taught me all kinds of stuff about the birth process, the muscles, the uterine muscles, how they work, and also what to expect in terms of when the contractions start, how they work, and what their role is in the way that it's described in hypnobirthing, in bringing the baby down and how the uterus does the work. And so I could go on about that, but I just want to share with you that taking the time to really educate myself around that was really, really helpful for the birthing process, both with my first and second son. And what I found, I guess, the most striking in this interview with Lori was how beneficial it would have been for me to know that I could have taken that same care and attention and really plan my breastfeeding journey, just to educate myself about it, just so that I had that knowledge and education about what's supposed to happen, what is a proper latch, how can you tell if your baby is actually drinking versus if they're just kind of suckling or sleeping, how to know if you have quote unquote enough milk, what are the signs that your baby might not be getting enough, and just also having those resources at hand. One of the things that I share in the interview that I did on Lori's podcast was how integral having support in a very timely fashion, the role that played in allowing me to continue breastfeeding. And it was a very humbling experience because I truly understand why not all women are able to continue to breastfeed. If I didn't have the support that I needed literally on the third day after my eldest son was born, by the third day for me, I had my son had a tongue tie, so there was some specific issues around that. But by the third day, it hurt so badly that I had to stop and I had to give him some formula because it hurt so bad. And I was beside myself because I was completely like anti-formula and I was crying and it was so emotional and that is just not a good time emotionally. Your progesterone levels like plummet from 11 times higher than what they are during your period to basically like nothing. And so it's a highly emotional time. Everything's raw. In a physical sense, you are raw. You've just given birth. And if you've had a C-section or if you've delivered vaginally, you are not physically to par. You're emotionally raw. You've just gone through one of the most intense, life-changing, powerful experiences of your life. And to top that off, you have this new thing that you're trying to learn, this new skill that you never thought was actually going to be a challenge for you, because it doesn't occur to most mothers that breastfeeding could even be a challenge. We're not really told anything about it. So I'm really, really happy to have had this interview with Lori. And I don't want to paint a really negative picture of breastfeeding. And I think that might be coming across like, oh, it's always going to be super hard and challenging. But that's not my intention. It's more to express that it can be challenging, but also that regardless of whether you have kind of a super straightforward experience or whether you have a more challenging experience, that it's a skill that you don't know how to do until you do it. There's still a lot to learn. And even if you have basically no challenges and it's all pretty straightforward, you probably would still benefit from some support, and you certainly would have kind of a better understanding and a smoother transition into this new world of breastfeeding if you actually had the education in advance. So I'm really excited to share this interview with you. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. So jump into the Facebook group if you're not part of it, the Facebook community that I host for the Fertility Friday community. And you'll find that at fertilityfriday.com/community. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about this episode. For those of you who have breastfed, what your experiences were like. And if any of you are planning for pregnancy or pregnant now, if this episode made a difference or at least got you thinking about the breastfeeding journey. And I just love the idea that Lori put out there with respect to finding a local La Leche League or finding a local breastfeeding group where you take your pregnant self to the group and talk to moms who are in the throes, just so that you have a better understanding of what to expect. I so wish that I had that opportunity. So I want to share it with all of you who are listening. So if you've been enjoying the podcast, please do look for it on iTunes and leave a 5-star review so that more people can find it. And make sure to head over to fertilityfriday.com and join my email list. And if you have an idea for a podcast episode or a guest suggestion, make sure to send me an email at info@fertilityfriday.com. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today. I appreciate all of you for taking the time to tune in to the podcast, to let me be part of your day. And as always, until next time, be well and happy charting.